What happens when the studio lights are bright? The audience is warm, and the person sitting across from you decides right there, in front of everyone, that you are the problem. It only took one comment. One single comment from Lorraine Kelly, delivered with that famous smile still sitting on her face, that turned a friendly morning chat into one of the most jaw-dropping, uncomfortable, and frankly unforgettable moments in daytime television history. And Ralf Little? He sat there. He listened. He tried to keep it together. But there is only so much a person can take before something inside them says, enough. This is the full story of what happened inside that studio. Every word, every silence, every moment that led to one of the most dramatic exits the show has ever seen. The Lorraine Show is one of those programs that feels like a warm cup of tea on a cold morning. The set is soft and cozy. The lighting is gentle. The host sits in her chair like she owns the whole world. And in that studio, she pretty much does. Lorraine Kelly has been doing this for a very long time. She knows how to make people feel welcome. She knows how to make them laugh. She knows how to make them open up. That is the job. That is the skill. And for years, she has done it brilliantly. But there is another side to that kind of power. When you control the room, when the cameras follow your lead, and the audience takes their cues from you, you can also use that position to make someone feel very, very small. Ralf Little walked into that studio not expecting a fight. He was there to talk. He was there to promote his work and to share a bit of himself with the morning audience. He sat down in that guest chair, smoothed his jacket, and looked across the coffee table at Lorraine Kelly with an open face. He had no idea what was coming. It was not just Lorraine in the studio that morning. The show had a panel set up alongside her. There were two other people sitting in on the conversation, both regulars on the show. On one side sat Carol, a TV presenter who had been on the show many times before and always seemed perfectly comfortable in that environment. On the other side was Mark, a commentator who had built a reputation for being outspoken, the kind of person who never struggled to find an opinion. These were Lorraine's people, her studio, her show, her guests, and Ralf Little was stepping into a space where the rules were already written, even if nobody had told him what they were. The atmosphere at the start was fine, genuinely fine. There was laughter. There was small talk. Lorraine leaned forward in the way that she does, the way that makes you feel like she is deeply interested in every word you say. And Ralf settled into it. He relaxed his shoulders. He started talking. The first few minutes were easy. Lorraine asked about his career, about where things were going, about the projects he had been working on. He answered honestly and with a kind of calm warmth. He was not performing. He was just talking. It started with a topic that Ralf had clearly thought a lot about. He began speaking about something that mattered to him deeply, something personal. The conversation shifted from light and breezy to something with a bit more weight to it. And that was when Lorraine changed. Not dramatically. Not right away. It was subtle at first. A small tilt of the head. A flicker behind the eyes. The kind of look that a person gives when they have already decided how they feel about something, and they are just waiting for the right moment to say it. Ralf was talking about the pressure that comes with being in the public eye. He was thoughtful about it. He was not complaining, not seeking sympathy. He was just being honest about a real experience. I think people forget, Ralf said, leaning forward slightly, that when your name is out there, every mistake gets magnified. Things that would be private for anyone else become headlines, and that is not easy to live with. There was a brief silence. Lorraine smiled, and then she said something that made the air in the room shift. Well, she said, her voice still bright and cheerful, I suppose that is what you sign up for when you choose to be famous, isn't it? Ralf blinked. He looked at her for a moment. I am not sure I would put it quite that way, he said, keeping his voice even. Nobody signs up to have their private life pulled apart. You sign up to do your job. That is different. Lorraine tilted her head again. The smile stayed exactly where it was. But surely, she said, glancing briefly at Carol beside her, you must have known what you were getting into. Carol nodded. Just slightly. Just enough. Ralph took a breath. He was not angry yet. He was careful. The kind of careful that a person uses when they feel the ground shifting under them, but they do not want to fall. Look, he said, I think there is a difference between being public about your work and consenting to have every part of your personal life become entertainment for strangers. Those are two completely separate things. Of course, Lorraine said, nodding in a way that suggested she was agreeing, while everything about her tone said she was not. But you are on television. People are interested in you. That is the deal. The deal, Ralph repeated, and now there was something behind his eyes, too. I did not shake hands on any deal that said my private life was fair game. I do not think anyone does. Mark, sitting on the other side, shifted in his seat. He had been quiet up until this point, but he clearly felt it was his moment to add something. I think what Lorraine is saying, Mark said, leaning forward with the confidence of a man who had not been asked to speak, is that fame comes with a cost. That is just reality. Ralph looked at Mark. There was a long pause. I know what she was saying, Ralph replied calmly. I am just telling you that I disagree with it. Fame does not cancel out the right to basic privacy. No job does that. The studio audience was very quiet. Not in an uncomfortable way yet, but in the way an audience gets when they realize that what is happening in front of them is real. This was not scripted banter. This was not friendly disagreement for the cameras. Something genuine was being said. Lorraine, to her credit as a professional, did not lose her composure. But what she did was something that many people watching later found far more troubling than losing her composure would have been. She leaned back slightly in her chair, glanced at Carol with just the faintest smile, and then looked back at Ralph with an expression that was almost amused. I wonder, she said, her voice carrying that particular kind of lightness that is designed to make a serious point feel small, if part of what we are hearing is just a little bit of frustration about how things are going at the moment. The room went very still. Ralph looked at her directly. His voice was steady. What do you mean by that? He asked. Lorraine gave a small wave of her hand, dismissive in the way that only someone very comfortable with power can be dismissive. Oh, nothing personal, she said. I just think sometimes when things are not going the way we hoped, it is easy to look for something to blame. The media, the public, that sort of thing. Ralph sat very still. I have not blamed anyone, he said quietly. I said that privacy matters. Those are not the same thing. Carol, clearly feeling the tension and perhaps wanting to help diffuse it in the least helpful way possible, jumped in. I think what Lorraine means, Carol said with a bright smile, is that the public just wants to feel connected to the people they watch on telly. It is not sinister. It is just love, really. Watching someone's private life fall apart is not love, Ralph said. And he did not say it loudly. He said it quietly, plainly, like a person stating a fact they had thought about many times before. What happened next was the moment. The real moment. The one that everyone who was watching would talk about afterwards. Replaying it in their heads, trying to understand exactly what they had just seen. While Lorraine shifted forward in her chair. She tilted her head to one side in that characteristic way of hers. And then, with the warmth and confidence of someone who absolutely believed they were being reasonable, she said, The thing is, Ralph, and I do say this with kindness, when you have had the kind of career that goes up and then, quietens down a little, sometimes that bitterness can come out in unexpected ways. And I just wonder if that is what we are seeing today. Dead silence. Not a murmur from the audience. Not a sound from Carol or Mark. Ralph looked at Lorraine. He looked at her for what felt like a very long time. I am going to stop you right there, he said. His voice was calm, completely calm. That particular kind of calm that people have when they have just been pushed past a point, and they are deciding what to do about it. I came here today to have a conversation, he said. I did not come here to be psychoanalyzed on morning television by someone who has known me for about 9 minutes. And I absolutely did not come here to have my career described as something that has quietened down, as if that is a fact you have established, or as if it is any kind of basis for dismissing everything I have just said. Lorraine opened her mouth. Ralf, I did not mean, she began. I know what you meant, he said, and that is the problem. Mark, sensing that the situation was now in a place that nobody had planned for, made a move. He leaned forward with the energy of a person who believed himself to be a calming influence, which he was absolutely not. Come on now, Mark said, with a little laugh that died almost immediately when he saw the expression on Ralph's face. We are all just having a conversation here. No need for anyone to... And here he paused, reaching for a word. Escalate. Ralf turned to look at him. Escalate, Ralf said. He repeated the word slowly, as if he was turning it over in his hands. I have not escalated anything. I have pushed back on something that was said to me that I thought was unfair. That is not escalation. That is a response. Of course, Mark said, nodding quickly. But maybe we can bring it back to... To what? Ralf said. And he looked genuinely curious. To what exactly? What would you like to bring it back to? Mark did not have a good answer to that. He sat back. Carol tried next. Carol always tried. I think Lorraine was really just trying to offer a perspective, Carol said, in the soothing voice of someone who has spent a lot of time smoothing things over. She did not mean it as an attack. She said my career had quietened down and that I was bitter, Ralf replied. Those were the words, not a perspective, not an observation. Those were specific claims about who I am and where I am in my life. And she said them with a smile, which somehow makes it worse. And here was the thing about Lorraine Kelly. She was not someone who apologized easily. That was not how she worked. That was not how she had ever worked. In her world, she asked the questions. In her world, she shaped the conversation. And being challenged on that, in her own studio, on her own show, by a guest, was something she genuinely did not seem to know how to handle. And so, she did not back down. I think you are being a little oversensitive, she said, and the smile came back. That warm, bright, dangerous smile. I really do. I was making a human observation. Not everything is an attack. Oversensitive, Ralf said, and he almost laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh that comes when something is so absurd that it overtakes every other reaction. You described my career as something that has quietened down. You suggested that everything I said about privacy was really just bitterness coming out. And when I said I disagreed with that, you told me I was oversensitive. Do you understand how that sounds? Lorraine spread her hands on the table. She tilted her head. I just think, she said, that people who come on television to share their opinions need to be prepared for a response. That is part of the conversation. A response? Yes, Ralf said. A personal attack dressed up as insight? No. The studio was so quiet. The kind of quiet that studios almost never are. People watching at home later said they could feel it. The moment where something shifted in the room. Where the audience in the studio stopped looking at Lorraine the way they always did, with warmth and familiarity, and started looking at her the way you look at someone who has just done something you cannot quite believe. Because Ralf was not shouting. He was not being aggressive. He was not doing any of the things that guests who get labeled as difficult usually do. He was sitting there, in that chair, looking directly at a woman who had just said something deeply unkind to him, and he was simply, carefully, precisely explaining why it was wrong. See, and Lorraine kept smiling. And that was the thing. The smile never left. It was welded to her face. And the more she smiled while saying things that were not kind, the more uncomfortable it became to watch. Look, Lorraine said, her voice softening in the way that people soften their voice when they want to sound like they are offering an olive branch without actually moving an inch. I have a lot of respect for you. I do. I always have. I just think this morning has perhaps got a little out of hand, and we should... Got a little out of hand, Ralf said, and he looked almost amused now, a different kind of amusement, the kind that comes when you have fully understood something. You spoke about my career and my character in a way I found to be unfair and inaccurate. I said so. That is not getting out of hand. That is a conversation. And the kind you are supposed to be good at. Mark, who had been very quiet since his last attempt to help had not helped at all, decided this was the moment to speak again. It was not the moment. I think, Mark said, with the measured tone of a man who believed his measured tone was an asset in all situations, that Ralf, you came in today with a kind of agenda, and that is fine. Everyone has an agenda. But when the conversation did not go the way you had planned, it seems like things got a bit, he paused, choosing his word with enormous care. Tense. Ralf turned to look at him slowly. Very slowly. An agenda, he said. What do you imagine my agenda was? Mark made a vague gesture with his hands. I do not know exactly, Mark said, but you came in with strong feelings about the media and about how celebrities are treated. And I think I shared my view on a topic, Ralf said, cutting through the sentence cleanly. That is not an agenda. That is called having a point of view. And then that point of view was not engaged with seriously. It was reduced to bitterness and career anxiety. By you, he looked at Lorraine, and by you, he looked at Mark. And that is what I am taking issue with. I did not reduce anything, Mark said, a flicker of irritation crossing his face now. You just told me I came in with an agenda because the conversation did not go the way I had planned, Ralf replied. Which implies that I planned for it to go a certain way, which implies that I came here with a strategy rather than a genuine opinion. Is that not a reduction? Mark had no answer to that. Carol's final attempt. Carol was, by this point, sitting with her hands folded in her lap in the way of a person who has accepted that the ship is going down and is trying to decide whether to get in a lifeboat or go down with it. She chose the lifeboat. Ralf, she said gently, as if she was addressing a child who had not understood something simple. We are all on the same side here. Lorraine was not trying to hurt you. Nobody was. I am glad to hear that, Ralf said, because what she said did hurt. Not because I am oversensitive, as she put it, but because it was inaccurate, and it was personal, and it was said as if it was an established truth. And I think when you say something like that to someone on live television, in front of a studio audience, you owe them the courtesy of at least acknowledging that you might have got it wrong. Carol looked at Lorraine. Lorraine looked at Ralf, and then Lorraine said the thing that nobody expected her to say. I stand by what I said, she told him, quietly, firmly. The smile slightly smaller now, but still there. I think I was offering a fair observation based on what you had shared, and I think your reaction today has been, well, revealing. That word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Revealing. Ralf said nothing for a moment. He pressed his lips together. He looked down at the table. Then he looked back up at Lorraine Kelly with a very clear, very steady gaze. Revealing, he said. I think so, yes, she said. So, he said slowly, I came here. I sat down. I shared a point of view. You told me it was bitterness. I said I disagreed. You told me I was oversensitive. I explained why that was not fair. And now you are telling me that my willingness to defend myself is revealing something. Can you tell me what exactly it is revealing? Lorraine gave a small shrug, the kind of shrug that is designed to look casual while communicating something quite specific. I just think that when someone reacts this strongly to a gentle observation, she said, it usually means the observation touched something real. Ralf nodded slowly. He looked at the table again. He picked up the glass of water that had been sitting untouched in front of him, took a sip, and set it back down. "Okay," he said. "Just that. Just okay." What followed was one of those moments on television that feels like it lasts far longer than it actually does. Ralph sat very still. He was not looking at Lorraine anymore. He was not looking at Carol or Mark. And he was looking at somewhere just past the camera, the way people look when they are having an internal conversation that nobody else can hear. Lorraine watched him. The smile was still on her face. It had not moved. It would not move. That smile was a professional instrument, and she was in complete control of it. Carol was very still. Mark was very still. The audience was very still. Somewhere off to the side, a producer was almost certainly having a very urgent and very quiet conversation with someone else. But none of that was visible in the studio. What was visible was a man sitting in a chair, making a decision. When Ralph spoke again, his voice was very even, very measured, the kind of measured that takes real effort. "I want to say something," he began, "and I want to say it clearly. I did not come here today to perform. I did not come here to be managed or to be read or to have my inner life explained back to me by people who do not know me. I came here because I was invited, because I thought it would be a good conversation, and I was wrong about that." Lorraine said nothing. "What has happened this morning," Ralph continued, "is that I shared a view. That view was dismissed, and then used against me. And when I objected to that, my objection was also dismissed, and then also used against me. That is not a conversation. That is a trap. And I am not going to sit here and pretend it is fine, because that is what you do on morning television." Lorraine shifted very slightly in her chair. For the first time since the conversation had turned, something in her expression changed. It was not quite discomfort, but it was not quite confidence either. "I do not think anyone was trying to trap you," she said, and her voice was slightly more careful than it had been before. "Maybe not intentionally," Ralph said, "but that is what happened, and I think that is worth saying out loud." Mark, who was a man constitutionally incapable of letting silence do its work, opened his mouth again. "I think we need to be careful," he said, "about the language we use. Trap is a very strong word." "I know it is," Ralph said, looking at him. "That is why I used it." "But do you not think," Mark said, pressing on with the determination of a man who could not read a room, "that maybe you are reading something sinister into something that was really just poor phrasing?" "Poor phrasing," Ralph repeated. He looked at Mark with genuine curiosity. "If you had said, 'Oh, I am not sure I phrased that well,' or, 'and that came out differently to how I meant it,' then yes. Poor phrasing. But Lorraine just told me that she stands by what she said. She confirmed it. She meant it. So it was not poor phrasing. It was the message. There is a difference." Mark looked at Lorraine. Lorraine looked at Ralph. There was a brief, electric silence. "Ralph," Lorraine said, and her tone had shifted again. This time it was gentler, more personal. The kind of voice she used when she was going for the emotional angle, the one that had made countless guests open up over the years. "I have been doing this show for a long time. I have sat across from a lot of people. And sometimes when I sense that someone is carrying something, I try to find it. I try to bring it to the surface. Because that is what this show is about. Connection. Honesty. Real conversations." Ralph listened to all of this. "And I appreciate that," he said, when she had finished. "I genuinely do. I think honest conversation is valuable. But there is a difference between drawing something out of someone with care and telling them what they are feeling before they have said it. You did not ask me if I was bitter. You told me that I was. And you told me with a smile in front of all these people, as if you were doing me a favor. That is not a real conversation. That is a verdict." The word verdict sat in the air of the studio. Something happened in the studio audience. A very small sound. Not quite a murmur. Not quite a reaction. But the kind of collective tiny shift in posture that people make when something has connected. When someone has said a thing that lands. Lorraine heard it. Yet she would have been a very different kind of professional if she had not. Her eyes moved briefly to the audience and then back to Ralf. The smile, for just a fraction of a second, wavered. I think, she said, picking her words more carefully now, that I perhaps did not frame things as well as I could have, and for that I am. You said you stand by what you said, Ralf said. His voice was not hard. It was very precise. Lorraine stopped. You said, and I remember the exact words, I stand by what I said. So when you now suggest that you did not frame things well, which of those two things is true? It was a very simple question, and Lorraine Kelly, one of the most experienced broadcasters in the country, did not have an answer for it. Carol, who had been quiet for a little while, and whose expression had gone through several different stages during the last few minutes, leaned forward. I think, she said carefully, what Ralf is saying is valid. I do. I think the way the conversation went put him in an unfair position. And I think if any of us had been in that position, we might have felt the same way. It was the closest anyone had come to acknowledging what had happened. And it was striking precisely because it came from someone who was supposed to be on Lorraine's side. Lorraine looked at Carol. The look was brief, unreadable, but it was there. Thank you, Ralf said to Carol simply. Of course, Carol said. Mark, sensing that the balance of the table had shifted in a way he had not anticipated, was very quiet. Lorraine, who was many things, but was never someone who gave up easily, made one final attempt to regain the shape of the conversation. I think what would be helpful, she said, is if we could move forward. Because I do not think that either of us, and here she used the word either very pointedly, as if the issue had been mutual, intended for this morning to go this way. I did not intend for it to go this way, Ralf said. That is correct. But I also did not intend to sit here and not say anything when I felt I was being treated unfairly. So here we are. Perhaps, Lorraine said, still smiling, still composed, we could find some common ground. What would that look like for you? Ralf looked at her for a long moment. It would look like you acknowledging that what you said was not fair, not reframing it, not explaining it, just saying, I got that wrong. That is all. That is the whole thing. Lorraine held his gaze. She did not say it. The silence stretched. Lorraine was looking at Ralf. Ralf was looking at Lorraine. Carol had her hands folded in her lap. Mark was studying something on the table. The studio felt very small, and then Ralf Little put both hands flat on his knees in a very particular way. The kind of way that a person puts their hands on their knees when they have made a decision, when the internal conversation that nobody else could hear has reached its conclusion. He looked at Lorraine one more time, and when he spoke, his voice was completely calm, absolutely clear, with no trace of anger, no trace of bitterness, and no trace of the thing that Lorraine had accused him of carrying from the moment he sat down. I think we are done here, he said. Nobody moved for a moment. Lorraine blinked. Just once. Now, Ralf, she began, and her voice had changed again. Sharper at the edges now, the warmth thinned out by something that was almost authority. I think we can... No, he said, just that one word. And it was not said loudly. It was not said rudely. It was said the way a person says something when they are absolutely, completely, and finally certain. He stood up from the chair. The audience made a sound, not a gasp. Something smaller and more stunned than a gasp. A collective exhale of disbelief. Ralf, Lorraine said again, and now there was a different quality to her voice. Something that might have been surprise, or something that might have been the edge of actual discomfort. He was already reaching for the small microphone that had been clipped to his shirt. he unclipped it carefully. He did not throw it down. He did not make a scene. He set it on the coffee table between them, gently, like placing something fragile on a shelf. "I appreciate the invitation," he said, to the table, to all three of them, to the studio, and everyone in it. "But I am not going to stay somewhere I am not being treated with basic respect. That applies everywhere, even here." He walked across the studio floor. Nobody stopped him. There was a moment where it seemed like someone might, where Lorraine half rose from her chair in a way that suggested movement without fully committing to it. But Ralph kept walking, and nobody followed. The cameras stayed on the set. On Lorraine and Carol and Mark, sitting at that coffee table with a microphone lying between them and an empty chair where Ralph had been sitting. Lorraine looked at the camera. For someone who had spent decades looking at cameras, this one moment was different. Because the camera was looking back at a woman who had just watched a guest get up and leave her show. And the studio audience was watching her, and the people at home were watching her. And in the silence that followed, it was very hard to know what anyone was supposed to do next. Carol looked at her hands. Mark looked at the empty chair. And Lorraine Kelly did what she always did. She smiled. She looked at the camera. She kept going. The thing about what happened in that studio is that it was not really about fame or privacy or careers at all. It was about something much simpler than any of that. It was about a person sitting in a chair and being told who they were by someone who had known them for less than 10 minutes. It was about a host who had so much control over her environment that she had perhaps forgotten what it felt like to not have it. It was about a panel that followed her lead so naturally that they could not see clearly when that lead went somewhere it should not have gone. And it was about a man who decided that he would rather walk away from a television show than sit there and pretend that none of it had happened. There is a version of this story where Ralf Little is the difficult guest. The one who could not handle a bit of gentle probing. The one who made a scene. The one who should have kept his head down and answered the questions and smiled for the cameras. But that version of the story requires you to believe that being told you are bitter is gentle probing. It requires you to believe that being told your career has quietened down is a fair observation. It requires you to believe that saying, "I disagree with that," is a scene. And if you watched what happened in that studio, it is very hard to believe any of those things. Because what you actually saw was a guest who was patient. A guest who was clear. A guest who asked only for the one thing that the host never gave him. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Not a reframing. Just 3 words. "I got that wrong." She never said them. And that is why he picked up his microphone, set it down gently on the table, stood up from the chair, and walked away. Right out of her studio, and into a moment that nobody who saw it would forget.